Hello and welcome to ESG Talk. We are so glad you're with us today. Whether you're listening on the go or at your work desk, we are delighted to spend the next 20 to 25 minutes with you. Remember, you're a part of the show and shaping it, so be sure to give us comments and ratings, as well as tell us what you think at ESG Talk on Twitter or on LinkedIn. Now, today I'm excited because we have Rob Fisher from KPMG. And here's two interesting facts about him that I think you will want to know. First things first, he leads KPMG's U.S. Impact Division. He's taken over this role this past year with a 27-year history of building and delivering results at KPMG. He designs ESG into operations and investments as companies try to tackle environment, social, and governance. The other fun thing to know about him is that he was named in 2022 as a global leader in consulting by Consulting Magazine. Rob, congratulations on what an incredible honor, awesome career. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mandy. I'm not sure I recognize entirely that person you just described, but yeah, that's cool. I appreciate it. Thanks.
We're so glad you're here. So we kick off this session with conversation starters. These are meant to be lighthearted and fun to help myself and those listening into the discussion today get to know you. It's fast, easy, and quick. Now, here's a little tip that I got from your team. They told me that you used to be in a college rock band or music band of some kind. Is that true?
Yeah, no, we got a very musical family. So yeah, I did a lot of music stuff in college. I still go to music festivals, and then my daughter now, she's kind of the current rocker in the family and out there, has stuff out on iTunes and stuff. So it's pretty cool.
That's fabulous. I can totally relate. My dad was a classical musician. So on the opposite spectrum, where I went to my preschool graduation, they asked what your favorite movie or video was. And I said Tosca, the opera. So nice. Completely different spectrum, nice. But totally understand the music family. So if you had intro music to today's show, what would that intro music be?
So I'm going to go a little off the board. So there's a band I love called Reverend Peyton's Big Damn Band, and they have a song called Music and Friends. And the chorus but a big part of the chorus is, I just want to make music and friends everywhere that I go. Been that way since I was 12 years old. And I just love, I've always played music. I've always listened to music, and it's an amazing way to make friendships and to connect with people. So that song's kind of a throwback to like old time blues, really old school blues and rock. And that kind of I think I'd go with that.
Yeah. Future episode, we got to know what your theme song is for ESG every year. Like, what do you listen to pump you up? We're asking every guest on the show, especially as people who have been veterans in the field, to think about moments that have shaped them, maybe a line of advice or a critical conversation. We have found that it's not really in this field big on stage moments that define us. For you particularly, because your work deals so integral with trust, what was a conversation around trust that shaped your ESG belief, philosophy, or direction in your work?
Yeah. And, as you said, there are some grizzled veterans in the field of ESG, and I'm not going to claim to be one of them. Luckily KPMG has been at this much longer than I have, but I was lucky enough to get asked to step in and lead just over a year ago now. But the conversation, I mentioned my daughter from a music perspective, but she is an environmental sciences student at Colorado Boulder. She was very active in high school as well. I think she was voted like crunchiest kid at her school or something. But conversation with her, honestly, is what really shaped my view on trust too around this topic, because she is so passionate. So many of her friends are so passionate about climate, for example, that and social issues of the day. Like, they have to live on this planet for a lot longer than I do. And so, she doesn't trust that my generation is going to do enough. And 2030 is a bit of an inflection point that if we haven't done enough, they kind of have to live with a planet that doesn't look very exciting. Like if you even look at like what 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise looks like, that's not a great outcome either. And that's sort of the best we can hope for. So if we get to 2, if we get, if we got to 4, it would be pretty catastrophic. And so, the trust that they have in our ability to make a difference is not high. And so I kind of hold that with me to say, hey, look, they're like my generation as business leaders right here and now, like the trust, we need to demonstrate and step up over the next, 7 to 8 years before we go past a bit of a bend point in terms of what we can do to bring things back.
Well, and I think that's an interesting dialogue as we think about the work of legacy, right? There's some of us in the field who are thinking about legacy, like you articulated, and then we're being pushed by investors and consumers. And I really appreciate KPMG focus. What you articulated so well when you were thinking about this legacy work is your impact, and really thinking about your ESG insights as enabling people and professionals around the planet to tap into the latest insights. Tell us a little bit more about the journey to create the insights, you as a leader working around that initiative, and why that was so critical to drive a legacy impact.
Yeah, great question, Andy. So I'm lucky in that KPMG more broadly has been at this a while. I would say we've in the US had a practice in sustainability for 15 or more years. And then you go all the way back. Our Dutch practice actually has been at this for over 30 years. And so, that's been incredibly helpful. And we have this legacy. We've been doing a net zero readiness index for many years. We've been doing a survey on sustainability reporting for many years. So, while things have really turbocharged in the last year, I would say. I mean, it's incredible. The investor focus in particular that has really driven so much activity. And now we're seeing the sort of the regulatory side of things follow. It's great that we have this base of studying the market for well over a decade to say, okay, how have things been moving? As we look at last year's net zero readiness index, we can piggyback it off of 5, 8, 10 years of studies to see, how are we moving the needle? And then we've just, we like others, I think we've been fairly public, about $1.5 billion of investment over the next 3 years, investing in things like our decarbonization and climate change hub that's led by a guy named Mike Hayes out of Ireland, just bringing incredible insights and thought leadership to the market. So it's great that we've done that, because if we were starting from a standing start like a year ago, I don't think we'd be able to bring nearly as much value to the market.
That's right. And I think that we'll put in the show notes a link to that hub and to the Insight Center, particularly as people try to grapple with some research. And I love that you recommended a decade of experience. That's what drew me into Workiva, was that they had been in technology around corporate social responsibility reporting for over a decade. And to your point, there's a lot of noise in the market. But those of us that have been in the work for the decade, or companies that have been there, there's so much insight, customer understanding, and the ability to really meet the needs. In fact, one of the surveys, and we'll again put this in the show notes for those listening into the discussion today, that I appreciated from KPMG was the over a decade of research around the survey of the sustainability report, and then really thinking about how companies are disclosing that. As you think about that particular sleeve of research, what are the takeaways for ESG leaders, C-suite, and boards as they consider 2022?
Yeah, so maybe this is my roundabout way of getting you to ask me back, I guess, because we do that survey every 2 years, and actually the survey has just gone out pretty much now to get the insights. So as soon as I have the 2022 survey, Mandy, you'll be the first to know, and it'll be me shilling to get back on the show, I guess. Yeah. But it's interesting, even if you look at like the 2020 survey, which was the last, and then you think about some of the things that have happened. So even in 2020, right, 80% of companies were reporting on sustainability, and kind of shockingly to me, North America had the highest participation rate. About 90% of the bigger public companies are reporting on sustainability. And then the report always goes after the 100 largest companies in like 52 different countries. So it's this really wide range. And I think 40% of those companies were disclosing something around climate in their actual financial disclosures. But obviously, as we now have like required climate disclosures, things like, that's going to dramatically go up. But I thought it was interesting that 40% were acknowledging, and that was like 15% higher than the survey 2 years before. But only 1 in 5 at the time were disclosing in accordance with TCFD. And so now I think that number would have ticked up. But now you've got, the ISSB, the SEC, and the EU all with we'll call it TCFD inspired requirement out there in some draft state waiting for comments and then a finalization. Unfortunately, we certainly wish they were all a little more closely aligned. Each have gone their own path in terms of the depth or the breadth of what exactly they're looking for from disclosure. The other thing is we saw that the majority do have a target in place. So more often than not, and that has certainly gone up. And people have linked, this trend of linking, not only saying what's the impact on my business, but what's the impact on my business on the world, and aligning to a science-based target. Certainly, we've seen that as a growing trend. And I think when we do the 2022 results, we'll see a huge uptick again in terms of having targets and linking both, getting a science-based target validated, for example.
And I think it's really critical because as we think about trust, Workiva just released a survey as well. And there's a show about it where we talk through people are unlocking business value drivers, the ones that have been reporting, that have a designated infrastructure, that have a staff. But even with all of the unlocking of business value, the reporting and building the frameworks, there's still a level of confidence that is lacking, or trust that, okay, everything I report is completely accurate. How can people think about that? Because like you said, the regulation's disparate. It's a growing and dynamic field. It's actually young, right? Like it hasn't been around as much as people like to say. Financial reporting, 100 plus years to get it right. ESG reporting, not so much. So how can people really start to have confidence in their reporting?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and certainly Workiva is positioned really in a really unique spot in that regard. I think to be helpful, as you're already seeing, but you look at it and you say, okay, CSR reporting in line with voluntary frameworks. And I was talking to a head of sustainability earlier, a really large U.S. company here just this morning, and it was the same conversation around, the current process is Excel, email, working in spreadsheets, a shared site where files are getting exchanged, and that's just really not going to be sustainable, no pun intended, going forward, especially where there's requirements now, right? I mean, in the U.S., if the climate proposal passes as is, there will be new financial disclosures. I mean, that's SOX 404 right there. Like that's going to, need to be at that level of rigor. But everything else that goes in the management report will be subject to 302 disclosure controls and procedures. So the level of rigor you need there, is dramatically stepped up. So we're seeing, ESG controller, a new title coming about, right? Where somebody in the organization, typically in finance, not necessarily in sustainability, is, now getting responsibility for the process, the control, the governance over the underlying data. So the sustainability team's still absolutely responsible for what are the right things to be in there, and what is our strategy and what are we doing about setting targets and monitoring. But the actual reporting, really seeing that move to finance and getting that level of rigor. And certainly people are saying, well, gosh, I use Workiva, for example, for my SEC reporting. Now there's this non-financial reporting, and Workiva's been on the front end of supporting voluntary frameworks. But now I'm sure you're going to be pivoting the product very quickly to be able to address, what's in the SEC requirements, what's in the EU requirements, and certainly the controls piece as well, right? The Sarbanes-Oxley-like control rigor that's going to come in, that organizations are looking, you're going to need a platform as well to be able to identify those controls, test those controls, and make sure that everything's working as one would hope.
Well, and I appreciate how you said it's a team sport, and we're seeing new and evolving jobs happen in the market. And over 7,000 plus ESG jobs were listed last year. And I think that's really key is what's so important is I tell people like stop fighting over what department, right? Like what department does this belong in? Or, it's like it's a team sport. It is going to take really talented finance upskilling, strong ESG upskilling, and it's collaborative across the business to drive value as well as data accuracy to build for future assurance, but also forward-looking projections to set your strategy. And that's going to take all of us together doing that work and to really think about the future of the work in that way. One of the things that I would love to hear more about is you formed together the trust imperative. Tell us how important you think trust is going to be to the stakeholders.
Yeah, I mean, really, before we really made some of the big announcements around our plans for investing in ESG, things like that, we were really on this topic of trust more broadly, right? And just the importance of, in a place where when you look at studies on trust, people don't trust government the way they used to. They certainly don't trust the media the way they used to, but their trust in business has actually been growing. So business has become this, sort of bellwether for trust that people are turning to. But yet it's hard in a very digitized world, and COVID, made us more and more comfortable doing everything remote and interacting via our phone with almost the entire world and companies. And so you have this interesting dynamic where it's really important to get it right in terms of security and privacy and following rules and regulations that are out there, as well as things like ESG and showing your impact in the community and in the world, your concern for your employees, your concern about customer preferences. So all these things are legs of trust, right? And so we've really oriented around that idea that risk and regulation, cyber, ESG, they're not just costs of doing business or risks to be managed, but they're value creation levers, and that more trust equals more growth, being able to innovate more confidently, retaining customers, things like that, right? All those will be benefits you gain from being trusted. And the thing about trust is it takes kind of a lifetime to earn it, and it can be lost in a moment. And so, the other part of trust is people's ability or companies' abilities to respond in the moment. Like everyone's going to suffer a cyber breach at some point, but how you respond to it, how you talk to your customers, how you take care of them, and you reassure investors, you talk to employees about what you're doing. I mean, those things, how you respond in the moment are going to decide whether people continue to trust you or whether you experience that loss of trust and correspondingly a loss of customers, maybe workers going out the door, investors pulling capital, all those kinds of negative consequences of not being trusted.
Well, I think that's an important part too when we think and unpack risk scenario testing, right? Is that a lot of times people hyper focus on the physical risk and the risk to your business. And with trust, there is a huge dynamic of stakeholder engagement. And if in a future show, we're going to unpack simplifying risk scenario testing. And if you're not looking at it from all the angles you articulated, the regulation angle, your investor angle, your employee angle, the public reputation angle, you're not really doing quality risk scenario testing. You're sort of just checking one box of an exercise. And that's where the preparedness of risk testing can drive value for your company because you're not responding in the moment. You've actually thoughtfully, with a collective team, holistically considered all your stakeholders. And that's where the future is. It is hard to believe that our 20 minutes have gone that fast. I think, Rob, you're right. We're going to have a future show where we can unpack more together. I want to wrap this up with one question. So, practical advice from you for companies on a quest to become trusted in their organization. What is one thing they can do in the next 6 months?
Yeah, well, I think you kind of already started to give that answer. You mentioned stakeholder engagement, right? It is I think doing more to focus on what do the various stakeholders want. So that may take the form of customer surveys and focus groups. Your employee surveys are treasure troves of data about how much they trust you. I think the focus has generally been on investors and regulators, but I think you have to look through those different lenses. I think from a investor and even a community perspective, you can look at things like ESG ratings, for example, and dig in there. And the rating agencies have a long way to go in terms of a bit more consistency, the way we're used to in credit markets. But you can pull those apart and really start to understand, okay, where am I struggling from an E, an S, and or a G perspective relative to peers and relative to general market expectations, and are there opportunities? So you start to form a view of yourself, kind of an outside-in view of how trusted you are by those different stakeholder groups. And then you can start to set action plans. You probably want to integrate that with your enterprise risk management program and identify where you have some top trust risks, and then set action plans to say, okay, we need to devote dollars, time, et cetera, moving the needle on this.
I appreciate that you went there with stakeholder engagement, the Workiva survey that we had the chat on prior to this show. We really talked about that the frequency of materiality and stakeholder engagement has increased. It used to be 3 or 4 years ago, biannual, pulse check, and now it's every year, look at it, review it, consider holes and opportunity. We even saw some initial companies moving to biannual and quarterly. And I think that frequency is going to become more real time as we head into the next 3 years, because we really are going to see the need to pulse and understand the stakeholder groups better. And so it'll be fun to see how innovation keeps up with that. It'll be fun to see how companies approach that. So great takeaway, stakeholder engagement, and for us in the discussion to stay on that. We really want to invite everybody who joined us today to connect with Rob on LinkedIn. Rob Fisher will also put in the show notes, again, the KPMG Hub, ESG Insights, the survey. Check out the results. We are so thankful that, Rob, you joined us today. Everybody stay tuned. Our next episode will be with Sarah Chapman, Global Chief Sustainability Officer at Manual Life. It will be an interesting conversation around impact and value that just builds on the discussion Rob and I had today. We'll talk soon, everyone.